Apart from mosquito nets, pens, paper, exercise books, textbooks, and a Wi-Fi connection, the school was in need of funds for long-term projects such as building a dining area, more classrooms, and increasing teachers' salaries so that they would stay longer at the school. The school ran from nursery to year 8. It had 3 high school classrooms, 2 dormitories, and a toilet block. There is a place where soccer is played and a very old broken down playground with a slide and a witch's hat of sorts. The kitchen was outdoors and the students ate under a mango tree, just like the headmaster. A small library was under construction. The admin block had a few PCs. Teachers could use them, but did so rarely, as far as I could see. Some students could pay their modest fees, $40 per term, but most could not, so the bishop paid them himself. The bishop rented a house in a nearby village, drove to and from the school in the school bus, and was on campus 24/7, most evenings as well. Bishop told me that he was having a frustrating experience with Agrippa and the overseas NGO based in Philadelphia. Bogart was helping him. He was a dynamic character who was basically handling all the day-to-day operations of the school, but most importantly, he was handling communications with Agrippa. I witnessed many of Agrippa's conversations with Bogart. And to my surprise, there were often half a dozen of these calls every day from Philadelphia. So from these conversations, it was clear that Agrippa was putting a lot of pressure on the bishop. It had all started well when Agrippa arrived, saw the school, and decided to offer to pay for scholarships for 10 students. This was a very charitable act, and of course the bishop accepted the offer. But soon it became clear that she had her own agenda. She wanted to use the school to raise funds overseas by taking photos and videos, etc. Well, this was fair enough, perhaps. But then unexpectedly, she started to try to unduly influence the school's programs and implement programs of her own as a condition of her help. As an example of what I mean, she insisted on the bishop stopping the school for an entire week before the end of year examinations, the government examinations, in order to have what she called an art week. Now, she was interested in art herself, and her husband was a well-known artist, my friend. But this involved closing down school programs for a week just before the government exams at the end of the year. Now, this art week, it turned out, was timed by Agrippa to coincide with her visit to the school on one of her twice-yearly visits to Ghana. On these visits, she arrived and stayed in a luxury hotel in Kpando, half an hour away, hired an air-conditioned vehicle and visited the school, and then expected to be treated like a princess, all based on the funds she had raised by advertising the school back in Philadelphia. It also transpired that when Agrippa arrived to visit the school, she took back a load of kente cloth to the USA to sell. Meanwhile, her volunteers, including myself, were expected to slum it in very trying conditions. Bogart seemed to spend half the day on the phone to Philadelphia. It seemed to me that the bishop had lost control of the school. I can't think of any school in the world that would have tolerated this situation. Every child and teacher in the school was to do non-academic things for an entire week on the week before the academic examinations. Now, I was not doubting the value of non-academic activities, but the timing was preposterous. All of this was run on a daily basis by smartphone from the US. I was further aghast to discover that this patron had no knowledge of how a school worked. Agrippa herself had never been a student at a school, let alone a teacher or a manager in a school. In fact, she had homeschooled her own children and been homeschooled herself. As the bishop became dependent on this patron, he lost more and more control of the school. It should be patron, not patron. That's the Spanish pronunciation. The American patron, she would, Agrippa, withhold funds until the bishop did what she wanted. Young volunteers, like the stooge who met me on the first day, barely out of her teens, and at their own expense, would be sent out to implement the policies of the overseas patron. These volunteers were often indoctrinated in the US with the agenda of the patron overseas and sent out to oppose many of the programs the bishop was running at the school. If the bishop did not go along with the programs, funds would be withheld and children would lose their sponsorship. After many discussions, I was instrumental in persuading the bishop to try and cut ties with Agrippa and to try and regain control of the school. He did this in the end, but it took some time, and Agrippa did not give up without a fight. Firstly, she was furious with me because I would not speak to her. I was so disappointed at the accommodation fiasco that I was afraid I would be rude to her on the phone. She even enlisted the help of her husband, my old friend, who called me to try to persuade me to get on board with her project. She basically wanted me to carry out her instructions and then tell the bishop what to do. Obviously, she thought it plausible that I would have more influence over the bishop than she would have at a distance. After a very few days, I had decided I would not play that role. Agrippa, once she realized I was not going to be her lackey, didn't give up without a fight. On her trips to Ghana, she had gathered many, quote, supporters whom she paid a retainer fee. One day, one of these unknowns arrived unannounced to the campus to find out what was happening at the school. This man moved around the place asking everybody questions and taking photos with his mobile phone, photographing me and everybody else, making videos and sending them straight back to Agrippa in Philadelphia. Gradually, the bishop and I drew up plans to find alternative sponsors for the project, people who wanted to help the bishop realize his goals. In the end, the bishop did manage to cut ties with this NGO. But as a consequence, he had to close the boarding house temporarily, as he did not have enough funds to feed the boarders. He asked the boarders to become day students and to stay with friends or relatives and to try and find maybe a homestay or something in the village for a while. After a few weeks in Ghana, I realized that what I was doing as a volunteer was not really what was needed. I was organizing a few workshops for teachers and students, but this was really mere tokenism, I think. What was really needed were resources and, of course, money. After asking the bishop for the story of how the school started, I realized that the school's budget was very small. Even the land the school was built on had only cost him 1,000 Australian dollars for about 5 or 6 acres. His major expense was not salaries for teachers. Granted, they were all untrained, but food to feed the children. He said about 75% of the total cost of sponsoring a child in the boarding was for food. I started to think about what I was doing, and I decided to try and think of ways to obtain funds for the school upon my return to Australia. But before that, I was to have the trip of my life, a return trip to northern Ghana to visit my old school.